It was just another hot afternoon at a busy gas station on the outskirts of town, the type of place that sees a steady stream of commuters, travelers, and locals filling up their tanks or grabbing a quick snack. People came and went, unaware of what was about to happen, a situation that would soon change lives and shake up the community. It started innocently enough, as most things do. A man in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered with an air of quiet authority, pulled into the station. Dressed casually in jeans and a polo shirt, he blended in easily. He wasn't anyone you looked twice at, just another person stopping to refuel on his way somewhere. But what no one knew yet was that this man was far from ordinary. As he stepped out of his car and walked over to the pump, two young white officers who'd been parked nearby noticed him. They exchanged a quick glance and smirked, something between a shared joke and the eagerness of someone itching to entertain themselves. They were new recruits, not long out of the academy, and they'd like to have fun on the job, sometimes pushing the boundaries a little too far. One of them elbowed the other. "Watch this," he whispered, already moving toward the man, who was calmly going about his business, focused on the pump and oblivious to the approaching officers. "Hey there, sir," one of the officers called out, a slight edge of mockery in his voice. "Got a minute?" The man looked up, clearly surprised. He studied the two officers, his calm gaze not giving much away. "Sure," he replied, a trace of curiosity in his voice. The other officer chimed in, "We just wanted to ask you a few questions, if that's all right. We noticed you seemed a little, suspicious." The officers laughed quietly between themselves, their smirks growing. It was the kind of joke they'd pulled before. A little intimidation to pass the time. A test of power to see how someone would react. But something was different about this man. He didn't seem nervous, didn't stammer or try to explain himself like they were used to seeing. Instead, he simply watched them waiting, as though they were the ones who needed to answer to him. It threw them off for a moment, but they quickly regained their composure, determined not to lose face. They asked for his ID, smirking, nudging each other like it was some inside joke only they got. The man calmly reached for his wallet, his expression still unreadable. Slowly, he pulled out a badge, a very specific, very official badge that instantly drained the color from their faces. For a long moment, there was silence. The officers stared, processing what they were looking at, their confident smirks fading into shock and disbelief. They realized, too late, that the joke they'd thought they were in on was about to turn on them in ways they never saw coming. The man standing in front of them wasn't just some random civilian. He was their new boss, the freshly appointed chief of police. The officers felt the world close in on them as they stared at the badge in the man's hand. For a moment, neither of them could speak. This couldn't be real. There had to be a mistake. They'd heard rumors that the department was bringing in someone new, a chief with a reputation for reform, but they never expected him to show up like this. In fact, they'd barely paid attention to the announcement, too busy with their usual routines to worry about the changes at the top. And now, standing before them, was the very man who'd been the talk of the station, the man they joked about, assuming he was some out-of-towner. Now their laughter seemed far away, replaced by a gut-wrenching sense of dread. The man, Chief David Bryant, held their gaze, his eyes steady and piercing. Yet he wasn't saying anything. He let the silence settle in, his expression unreadable. The officers shifted nervously, the weight of the situation sinking in. The chief didn't need to yell or berate them. His silence was enough to drive home the gravity of their mistake. Slowly, one of the officers, Officer Carter, managed to stammer out a weak, we didn't know, sir. We thought, but his voice trailed off, leaving the rest unspoken. Chief Bryant finally lowered his badge, slipping it back into his wallet with a calm, measured movement. His expression softened slightly, but there was a hint of disappointment that cut deeper than any anger. "You thought I was a threat," he said, his voice calm but firm. The words hit them hard. He didn't need to say much, just a simple statement that left them feeling exposed, small, and foolish. The other officer, Williams, tried to salvage the situation, reaching for something that could lessen the impact. "Sir, we were just doing our job," he mumbled, but he knew, even as he said it, how hollow the words sounded. Deep down, he knew that what they'd done hadn't been part of any duty, that they'd stepped over a line out of arrogance and habit. The chief nodded slowly, seeming to consider their words. "Your job," he repeated, as if testing the phrase, letting the weight of it settle in the air between them. His gaze was sharp, unyielding, and in it they felt the full force of a man who'd been through a lot, who understood the streets, the uniform, and the community in ways they could hardly imagine. They couldn't help but wonder what he saw in them, whether he saw the cracks in their confidence, the arrogance they'd relied on. Without another word, Chief Bryant turned away from them and continued with his task at the gas pump, leaving the officers standing there, feeling more like intruders than protectors. For a brief moment, they exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. Should they leave, stay and apologize? But something in the chief's quiet dismissal told them that whatever they had to say would only make things worse. As the chief finished pumping gas, memories began to stir within him. He remembered his own days as a rookie, the early years when he'd been filled with optimism and a desire to make a difference. He'd worked hard, enduring long hours and dangerous situations, but he also faced moments like these, moments when he, too, had been judged unfairly. It had been a long time since he thought about those experiences, but now they came flooding back, mingling with a deep resolve. He knew that change wouldn't be easy, that it would take more than policies and training. Real change had to start with people, with their attitudes and the way they treated each other. He looked back at the two officers, who were still rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do. With a slight nod, he motioned for them to follow him, and they did so hesitantly, as if walking to their own sentencing. Chief Bryant walked over to a bench near the gas station and took a seat, signaling for them to join him. They sat, their postures tense, bracing themselves for whatever lecture or reprimand he was about to deliver. But to their surprise, he didn't lecture them. Instead, he leaned back, looking out at the busy road ahead, his tone calm and reflective. "You know, when I first started out, I thought I understood what it meant to wear this uniform," he began, his voice carrying a weight of experience. "But I quickly learned that this job is about more than a badge, more than just enforcing laws. It's about respect, both giving it and earning it. And respect isn't just for those who look like you or those who wear a uniform. It's for everyone." The two officers listened, the discomfort shifting into something deeper. There was something different about the chief's tone, something they weren't used to hearing. He wasn't scolding them. He was trying to get them to see something they'd overlooked. "We're entrusted with a lot of power," the chief continued, "and it's easy to forget that this power is a responsibility, not a privilege. We're here to protect, not to intimidate. Every person we interact with, every small choice we make, adds up to what the community thinks of us. That matters more than you can imagine." He looked at them, letting the weight of his words sink in. They glanced at each other, still uneasy but starting to feel a flicker of understanding. They'd always thought of their job in black and white, upholding the law, making arrests, writing reports. But what Chief Bryant was talking about was something deeper, something they hadn't fully considered. "Everyone out there," the chief said, nodding towards the road, "they're watching us, forming opinions. And every time we choose to act in a way that's dismissive or arrogant, we lose a little bit of trust. Trust is hard to gain and so easy to lose." His words hung in the air, a quiet reminder of the power they held, not just in their authority, but in the way they made people feel. The chief paused, looking at them both, his gaze thoughtful but firm. "I want this department to be known for something different. I want people to look at us and see integrity, fairness, and respect. If we can't do that, we're not doing our job right." As he spoke, both officers felt an unfamiliar sense of humility wash over them. They'd never thought of the job this way, and it was clear that Chief Bryant was unlike any other superior they'd had. He wasn't about issuing orders from a distance. He was willing to sit with them, to share his experiences, to challenge them in a way that didn't belittle, but made them think. When he finished speaking, he rose from the bench, his presence commanding but calm. "Think about what you did today," he said, his voice steady. "Not as a mistake to be covered up, but as a lesson to be learned. If you want to make a difference, it starts with owning up to the things that go wrong and finding a way to make them right." With that, he nodded to both of them and began walking back to his car, leaving them to sit with his words. The officers remained on the bench, the weight of the chief's message lingering between them. They glanced at each other, unsure of what to say, each of them silently turning over the chief's words in their minds. As Chief Bryant drove away, a new resolve settled within him. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, that there were attitudes and habits deeply embedded in the force, but he also knew that change didn't happen overnight. It happened one step at a time, with moments like this, a quiet confrontation that had the potential to shift perspectives, to open eyes. Back on the bench, the officers sat in silence, each of them coming to terms with the realization that their new chief wasn't just another man in a suit, far removed from the reality of their job. He was someone who lived it, who understood it from the inside out. And for the first time, they began to question what kind of officers they wanted to be, what kind of legacy they wanted to leave behind. In the days that followed, the incident at the gas station lingered in the minds of Officers Carter and Williams, each replaying Chief Bryant's words in their heads. The usual joking around in the locker room felt different now. They couldn't shake the feeling that they'd crossed a line, one they hadn't even seen until Bryant held up a mirror to it. They were used to seeing their uniform as a shield, a layer of authority that automatically commanded respect. But now they wondered how much of that respect was earned and how much was just fear or resignation from the people they interacted with. This shift in perspective didn't sit easily with them. They found themselves looking over their shoulders, expecting Chief Bryant to be watching, assessing their every move, even though he hadn't mentioned the incident since. Chief Bryant, meanwhile, had his own concerns. Taking on the role of chief in a town where trust in the police was fragile was no small task. He knew he was up against an old guard, an ingrained culture that saw the uniform as a boundary rather than a bridge. As he settled into his office, he began digging through department files, trying to understand the deeper layers of the system he'd inherited. What he found was a web of small but telling habits, cases that had been overlooked, complaints that had been dismissed without thorough investigation, and a long history of routine stops that seemed anything but routine. Late one evening, as he sat alone in his office, Chief Bryant heard a knock at his door. He looked up to see Officer Maria Thompson, one of the few women on the force and someone he'd heard good things about. She had a reputation for being thorough and fair, a voice of reason in a station often filled with bravado and unchecked egos. She stepped inside, a hesitant but determined look on her face. "Chief," she began, "I wanted to talk to you about something that's been bothering me for a while." She hesitated, glancing around as if checking that no one else could hear. Chief Bryant gestured for her to sit, and she took a seat, looking down her hands before meeting his gaze. "There's been a pattern here," she said slowly, her voice low but steady. "Certain officers seem to be targeting specific neighborhoods, pulling over people for minor things and, well, escalating from there." She paused, trying to gauge his reaction, but he simply nodded, his expression encouraging her to continue. "I've tried to speak up about it before, but no one seemed interested. They dismissed it as just part of the job. But it doesn't feel right, Chief. It's one thing to enforce the law, but this, it feels like intimidation." Bryant felt a pang of anger, not at her but at the system that had made her feel like she couldn't speak up. "Thank you, Officer Thompson. I appreciate your honesty," he said, his voice steady. "And you're not alone in noticing this. It's something I've been seeing as well." She looked at him, relief softening her expression, though it was clear that years of pushing against this silent force had left her wary. Thompson nodded, visibly encouraged but still cautious. "I just don't want to see things get swept under the rug again," she added. "People need to know that we're here to help, not to make their lives harder, and we owe it to ourselves to hold each other accountable." After she left, Bryant leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Her words echoed his own beliefs, and it was a relief to know he wasn't alone in wanting to rebuild trust, but he also understood the risks. Speaking out in this way wasn't easy, especially in a department that resisted change. He wondered if others felt the same, but were too afraid to voice it, worried about the backlash. He made a mental note to find those officers, to show them they weren't alone. The next morning, Bryant held a department-wide meeting, something he rarely did, knowing it could spark resistance if he wasn't careful. He kept his tone even, addressing the officers with respect but an unmistakable firmness. He talked about the importance of community trust, of treating people with dignity. He didn't mention the incident at the gas station, but chose his words carefully, making sure they hit close to home for those who needed to hear it most. Officer Carter shifted uncomfortably, stealing a glance at Officer Williams. The chief's words felt like a spotlight shining directly on them, and they couldn't ignore the tension that had been building between them since the gas station. Williams, who was often the more carefree of the two, now wore a serious expression, as if weighing every word. It was clear that Bryant's approach wasn't just about speeches. It was about setting a standard, one they could no longer ignore. Outside the department, people in the community had started to take notice. News of a new chief, someone rumored to be different, had spread quickly. Some people were hopeful, others skeptical. A local community leader, Marcus Reed, had been an outspoken critic of the police for years, frustrated by what he saw as unfair treatment of his neighbors. Reed was known for organizing gatherings, speaking out against incidents that seemed to get swept under the rug. When he heard about Bryant's arrival, he wasn't sure what to make of it. He'd seen too many promises go unfulfilled, too many leaders who claimed they would bring change, but only ended up maintaining the status quo. Still, curiosity got the better of him, and he reached out, arranging a meeting with Bryant. When they finally sat down across from each other in Bryant's office, there was a wary respect between them. Reed didn't mince words, bringing up specific cases he felt had been mishandled and talking about the daily frustrations his community faced. Bryant listened without interruption, nodding as Reed spoke, his expression open and attentive. When Reed finished, Bryant took a moment before responding. "I hear you, Marcus," he said, using Reed's first name intentionally, showing him that he saw him as an equal. "I won't promise that things will change overnight, but I can promise that I'm here to listen and to act where I can. This is a partnership, and I need people like you who care about this community to work with us, to hold us accountable." Reed nodded slowly, his skepticism giving way to a cautious optimism. For the first time in a long while, he felt that someone was truly listening. Meanwhile, back in the department, the tension was only growing. Rumors started circulating that Bryant was planning to bring in outside consultants to review the department's practices, a move that unsettled the old guard. Some officers muttered about him rocking the boat, while others resented the scrutiny, seeing it as a threat to their autonomy. The station was divided, with some officers embracing the change and others pushing back, holding on to the old ways out of fear or stubbornness. One night, after another long shift, Carter and Williams found themselves in a local bar, sharing a drink in uneasy silence. Carter was the first to speak, breaking the tension that had built up between them. "You think he's serious about all this?" he asked, swirling his glass. "This whole rebuilding trust thing?" Williams shrugged, though his usual nonchalance was missing. "I don't know, man, but it feels different. Like he actually means it." He paused, looking down. "I don't know about you, but I've been thinking about what happened at that gas station. I keep wondering how I'd feel if someone pulled that on me." His voice was low, a realization settling him uncomfortably. Carter nodded, feeling the same discomfort gnawing at him. For the first time, he was seeing his actions from the other side, understanding the impact in a way that training had never taught him. The chief's words, his quiet authority, had left a lasting impression on both of them. They knew they had a choice, to resist or to change, to prove that they could be better than the sum of their mistakes. As they sat there in silence, each lost in thought, Bryant was back in his office, sifting through more files, determined to understand every corner of his new department. He knew he'd rattled some cages, but he also knew that real change wouldn't come without resistance. He wasn't just trying to change policies, he was trying to change hearts and minds, to shift an entire culture one person at a time. And in the stillness of his office, he felt the weight of that responsibility, the challenge of bringing light into the shadows that had lingered for far too long. As the weeks passed, Chief Bryant's presence began to ripple through the department and beyond. Officers felt his influence in the new policies, the stricter guidelines on stops and searches, and the emphasis on respect and accountability. The changes made some officers uneasy, others resentful. Small groups began forming within the department, whispers of resistance spreading among those who saw Bryant as a threat to their way of life. They felt he was going too far, pushing for a level of reform they hadn't signed up for. But there were others, like Officer Thompson, who welcomed the change, believing it was a long overdue shift toward fairness and integrity. In the middle of this quiet storm, Officers Carter and Williams found themselves at a crossroads. They were no longer as confident as they once were, haunted by the memory of their encounter with Bryant and the dawning awareness of how easily they had fallen into old habits. The chief's words played on a loop in their minds, forcing them to see their work and themselves through new eyes. They knew they were under close watch now, not just by Bryant, but by their own consciences, a constant reminder that they had the power to neither harm or help with each interaction. But every time they tried to act differently, they'd faced pushback from colleagues who weren't on board with Bryant's vision. One cold evening, a call came over the radio that immediately set the whole station on edge. A young black man had been stopped at the edge of town, near an area known for petty crimes and occasional gang activity. The officers who had made the stop reported that the man matched the description of someone they were looking for in connection with a recent string of thefts. Carter and Williams listened to the call, a strange unease building between them. The tone of the officers on the scene was familiar, cocky, assured. It reminded them of how they'd sounded at the gas station. Chief Bryant, who had been reviewing paperwork nearby, looked up sharply when he heard the call. He quickly grabbed his coat and gestured for Carter and Williams to follow him. The two exchanged a glance, sensing the gravity of the situation. They could tell that Bryant was not going to let this unfold like any ordinary stop. When they arrived on the scene, the young man was standing beside his car, visibly nervous, his hands raised slightly, as if unsure of what would happen next. The officers on the scene, two of the department's more seasoned veterans, had him surrounded, their stances tense and unwelcoming. They were speaking to him in a curt, almost mocking tone, making the young man shift uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the ground as if he wanted to disappear. Bryant took in the scene with a quiet intensity, his gaze flicking between the officers and the young man. He could see what was happening, the way the officers were leaning into their authority, making the young man feel small, powerless. Without raising his voice, Bryant stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding attention. The officers turned, surprised to see him there, but before they could speak, he held up a hand, signaling for them to stay back. The young man looked up, startled to see Bryant, and his eyes widened in recognition. Bryant offered him a small, reassuring nod, a silent promise that he was safe. He turned to the officers, his voice calm but firm. Why was he stopped? He asked, his tone neutral, but carrying an edge that made it clear he expected a straightforward answer. One of the officers cleared his throat, glancing awkwardly at his partner. He matched the description, Chief, he said, though there was a defensive note in his voice. We were just doing our job, making sure he wasn't the guy we're looking for. Bryant nodded slowly, considering their words. Did you run his information? Did you give him a chance to explain? His questions were simple, but each one felt like a challenge, a subtle nudge at the assumptions they'd made, the shortcuts they'd taken. The officers looked at each other, visibly uncomfortable, but neither spoke. Bryant's gaze remained steady, his silence pushing them to answer. Finally, one of them muttered, We're getting to that, Chief. Bryant's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He turned to Carter and Williams, who had been watching in silence, absorbing every word, every detail. Officers, he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight they hadn't heard before. Why don't you take this gentleman's information, confirm it, and if everything checks out, make sure he gets home safely. Carter and Williams nodded, stepping forward to handle the situation as the other officers shifted uncomfortably, a faint trace of resentment flashing in their eyes. They knew this was a message from Bryant, a reminder that the way things had been done before was no longer acceptable. Bryant's intervention had disrupted the familiar rhythm, the unspoken rules they'd followed for years. And while Carter and Williams felt a sense of relief, they also sensed the tension growing, like a brewing storm that had no clear direction. As they took the young man's information and walked him through the process, they felt the weight of Bryant's watchful gaze, but this time it didn't feel intimidating. It felt like support, like someone holding them to a higher standard, believing they could meet it. The young man, now visibly calmer, thanked them, his voice filled with a quiet gratitude that made them feel a strange, unfamiliar pride. For once, they felt they'd done something right, something that had helped rather than harmed. But not everyone felt the same way. Later that night, in the dimly lit back room of a bar frequented by off-duty officers, a group of Bryant's critics gathered, their faces set in grim expressions. They were angry, feeling betrayed by a chief who, in their eyes, seemed more interested in appeasing the public than in backing his own force. One officer, a grizzled veteran named Mullins, slammed his drink down on the table, his voice rising above the quiet murmurs. "He's trying to make us look weak, like we're the enemy." He fumed, his face red with frustration. "We've been doing this job for years, and now he waltzes in and acts like he knows better." Another officer nodded, his eyes hard. "He's not one of us," he muttered, his voice laced with resentment. "He doesn't understand what it's like out there, what we have to deal with." Round the table, heads nodded in agreement, the anger and frustration building into something heavier, something that felt almost dangerous. They felt abandoned, alienated by a leader who, they believed, cared more about his image than the challenges they faced. As the night wore on, their words grew sharper, their voices louder, their grievances intensifying. They'd felt like soldiers left behind, their authority undermined by someone who didn't understand the reality they lived every day. By the time they left the bar, their discontent had hardened into something close to rebellion. They were tired of being questioned, tired of feeling like they had to second-guess their every action. The tension in the department reached its peak in the following days. Bryant could sense it, feel the resentment building like a pressure cooker ready to explode. He knew his stance had made him enemies, that his vision for change had alienated those who clung to the old ways. He received reports of officers ignoring his orders, bending the rules in subtle, defiant acts that hinted at a growing rift. But he refused to back down, knowing that to do so would mean sacrificing the integrity he had worked so hard to instill. Then, late one night, Bryant received a call that sent a chill down his spine. A group of officers had been seen in a tense confrontation with a group of local teens in a neighborhood known for its distrust of the police. The situation was escalating, and there were rumors that one of the officers had made a threat, a veiled warning that had stirred up fear and anger among the residents. Without hesitation, Bryant grabbed his coat, heading out into the night, his mind racing. He knew this could be the moment that determined everything, the breaking point that would either solidify his vision or tear it apart. As he drove through the silent streets, his thoughts were consumed with the weight of what lay ahead, the realization that his efforts had brought him to the edge of a precipice. He knew that whatever happened next would not only define his role as chief, but could reshape the entire community's view of the police. And as he drew closer to the scene, the tension in the air felt thick, electric, like a storm on the verge of breaking. As Chief Bryant pulled up to the neighborhood, the scene was more chaotic than he had anticipated. A small crowd had gathered, their faces tense and filled with a mix of fear, anger, and frustration. The streetlights cast a dim glow over the area, illuminating the officers who stood in a rigid line, their expressions hard as they faced the residents. The young teens at the center of the disturbance looked defiant, arms crossed, challenging the officers with a silent stare. It was clear that whatever had started as a minor confrontation had spiraled into something far more volatile. Bryant scanned the scene, recognizing the signs of a standoff that could go wrong in an instant. His eyes fell on Officer Mullins, who was at the front of the line, his face red with anger, his hand hovering dangerously close to his holster. Mullins was one of the officers who had opposed Bryant's new approach from the beginning, and tonight he looked like he was done pretending to respect the chief's authority. Bryant could see it in Mullins' stance, in the defiance in his eyes. It wasn't just about this moment. It was about everything that had been brewing since Bryant took charge. The crowd murmured anxiously, their voices rising in a crescendo of worry. Bryant felt the weight of their expectations, their hopes that he would step in and defuse the situation. He took a deep breath, stepping forward, his presence commanding attention. "Mullins," he called out, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "I'll take it from here." But instead of stepping back, Mullins stood his ground, his expression hardening. He seemed to be fueled by the adrenaline of the moment, as if he saw this as his chance to push back against Bryant's leadership. "Chief," Mullins replied, his voice laced with sarcasm, "these kids have been causing trouble here for months. If we don't handle it now, they'll just keep pushing us." He gestured to the crowd, his voice rising as if he were trying to rally the other officers. "This is why we can't go soft on them. They don't respect us, and you know it." His words hit the crowd like a slap, causing a ripple of anger to spread. The residents knew Mullins' reputation, knew he was the type to take matters into his own hands, to push boundaries without considering the consequences. Bryant felt the tension rise, sensing that the situation was on the verge of tipping over. He took another step forward, his voice calm but firm. "I'm telling you, Mullins, this isn't the way. These are just kids, and they're part of this community. We're here to protect them, not intimidate them." He looked Mullins straight in the eye, making it clear that this was not a request but an order. The officers standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, watching the exchange with wary eyes, uncertain of who to side with. Then, in a move that surprised everyone, Mullins shook his head and muttered under his breath, "You're just another outsider who doesn't get it." He turned to his fellow officers, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "I've had enough of this. Who's with me?" For a split second, there was silence as everyone processed his words. But slowly, two other officers stepped forward, their faces filled with the same resentment, the same disillusionment that Mullins wore like armor. Bryant felt a cold chill run through him as he realized what was happening. Mullins was leading a small but powerful mutiny, right here, right now. The crowd gasped as Mullins and his allies took a few steps back, as if signaling their defiance to everyone present. Bryant's heart pounded as he understood the full weight of this moment. If he didn't handle this carefully, the entire department could be torn apart, and with it, any hope he had of changing things for the better. He took a deep breath, meeting Mullins' gaze with a steely resolve. "You can leave if you don't want to be part of this department," Bryant said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "But if you're staying, you'll follow my orders. We serve this community. We don't rule over it." Mullins sneered, the anger in his eyes barely contained. But before he could respond, a voice from the crowd called out, "Chief, thank you." It was Marcus Reed, the community leader who had met with Bryant weeks before. He stepped forward, his expression filled with respect and gratitude, his voice steady as he addressed the officers. "This is what we've been waiting for. Someone who cares about our families, about our kids. If you're not here to do right by us, then maybe you're in the wrong line of work." Reed's words struck a chord with the crowd, who nodded in agreement, murmuring their support. Mullins' face twisted with anger, and he glanced at his allies, his resolve wavering as he realized that the crowd was turning against him. He looked back at Bryant, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and desperation. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, like he might push this standoff to its breaking point. But then, almost imperceptibly, he took a step back, his posture deflating as he recognized that his show of resistance had failed. Without another word, Mullins and the two other officers turned and walked away, their footsteps echoing in the tense silence. Bryant watched them go, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. He knew that the department would be divided in the days to come, that the road ahead would be filled with challenges and resistance. But he also knew that this moment, this show of courage and integrity, had made a difference. The community had seen it, felt it, and he could see the respect in their eyes as they looked at him, finally seeing him as someone who was truly on their side. As the crowd began to disperse, a young boy approached Bryant, his eyes wide with awe. "Are you really the chief?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Bryant knelt down, offering the boy a warm smile. "Yes, I am," he replied, his voice gentle. "And I'm here to make sure this town is safe for everyone, including you." The boy grinned, and in that moment, Bryant felt the weight of his role lift, replaced by a deep sense of purpose. But as he stood, his eyes scanning the now quiet street, he knew that tonight's events had only set the stage for the battles to come. Mullins and those like him wouldn't go quietly, and Bryant would have to be vigilant, prepared to face whatever challenges they threw his way. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the journey ahead, knowing that he had made enemies tonight, but also that he had gained something far more valuable, the trust of the people he'd sworn to protect. In the days following the confrontation, the entire town buzzed with the news of what had happened that night. Chief Bryant's stand against his own officers had become the talk of the community, with many residents feeling a cautious sense of hope. For the first time, people were beginning to believe that change might actually be possible. But within the department, the atmosphere had turned tense and uneasy. Officers who'd once taken pride in their loyalty to one another now found themselves questioning where they stood. There were whispers about who might support the chief and who might quietly side with Mullins. Lines were being drawn, even if no one dared to say it out loud. Chief Bryant sensed the growing divide but pressed forward, knowing that any hesitation could jeopardize the progress he'd fought to achieve. He was implementing new training, holding forums with community leaders, and conducting regular one-on-one meetings with his officers. He wanted them to understand the mission, to see that protecting the town didn't mean intimidating or alienating its residents. But as the weeks went on, the tension lingered, an unspoken threat that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. One night, as Bryant was finishing up some paperwork late at the station, he heard the faint hum of voices in the hallway. He glanced at his watch. It was well past midnight, and only a handful of officers should still be around. His curiosity piqued, he rose quietly and moved toward the sound, following the hushed tones to the break room. Inside, he saw Mullins and a group of officers gathered around a table, their faces shadowed in the dim light, their voices low but intense. The conversation halted abruptly as they noticed him standing in the doorway. A heavy silence fell over the room as Bryant took a step inside, his gaze steady as he looked from one officer to the next. Mullins, who sat at the center of the group, met his eyes with a barely concealed smirk, as if daring him to say something. Bryant knew that confronting them here could backfire, that a showdown in front of the others could further divide the department. But he couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in his gut, the feeling that something was brewing under the surface. Mullins leaned back, crossing his arms with a smug confidence that Bryant recognized all too well. "Chief," he said, his tone dripping with feigned politeness. "We were just having a little chat about the new direction of our department. Seems like not everyone's thrilled about the changes." A few of the officers chuckled, their laughter low and mocking. Bryant could sense the defiance in their faces, a silent declaration that they didn't plan to change just because he'd ordered them to. Bryant took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I understand that change isn't easy," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But we all signed up to serve and protect this community. That means we adapt, we grow, and we hold ourselves to the highest standard. Because that's what the people of this town deserve." Mullins chuckled, shaking his head. "You think you can just come in here and erase years of how we've been doing things?" he asked, his voice sharp. "The people in this room, we're the ones who have been on these streets, putting in the work, risking our lives. And you want us to change, just like that?" He snapped his fingers, the gesture dismissive, a mocking echo of Bryant's authority. Bryant stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Yes," he said simply, "because that's what it takes to be a real officer. Adapting, evolving, protecting everyone, not just the people we think deserve it." His voice was steady, but inside, he felt the weight of the room, the walls almost closing in as he spoke. For a moment, Mullins seemed taken aback, as if he hadn't expected Bryant to respond with such conviction. But then, as if making a final decision, Mullins leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. "You may be the chief," he said softly, his words laced with an unspoken threat. "But you don't own this department. You can't control what goes on behind closed doors." The words hung in the air, their meaning as clear as if Mullins had shouted them. Bryant felt a chill run through him, sensing the darkness that lay beneath Mullins' words, the implication that there were things happening in his own department that he couldn't see, couldn't stop. For the first time, he wondered just how deep the resistance ran. How many of his officers were loyal to the old ways? But before Bryant could respond, a sudden movement caught his eye. One of the younger officers, a rookie named Daniels, stood up, his face flushed with emotion. "No," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "The chief is right. We're supposed to protect people, not bully them. I didn't sign up to treat people like they're the enemy." His words sent a shockwave through the room, and for a moment, everyone stared at him in stunned silence. Mullins sneered, his face twisted with contempt. "You're just a kid," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "You don't know anything about what it's really like out there." But Daniels held his ground, his gaze defiant as he looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his fellow officers. "Maybe I don't," he admitted, "but I know what's right. And what we did that night, that wasn't it." Bryant felt a surge of pride as he watched Daniels speak. His words like a spark in the darkness, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. He looked around the room, seeing the uncertainty on the faces of the other officers, the way they shifted uncomfortably, as if Daniel's words had struck a nerve. And in that moment, Bryant realized that the battle for the department's soul wasn't over, not by a long shot. But then, just as the tension seemed to be reaching its peak, a sudden noise shattered the silence. A police radio crackled to life, the voice on the other end filled with urgency. "All units, we have a hostage situation at the corner of 5th and Main. Repeat, hostage situation. Suspect is armed and dangerous." The words sent a jolt through the room, and without hesitation, the officers jumped into action, grabbing their gear and heading for the door. Bryant watched them go, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him like a dark cloud. He knew that this was it, the moment that would define everything. The officers would have to work together, rely on each other in a way they hadn't since he'd taken over as chief. And as he followed them out, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the final test. A chance to prove that they were more than the divisions that had threatened to tear them apart. When they arrived at the scene, the air was thick with tension. A man stood inside a small store, holding a gun to the cashier's head, his eyes wild with desperation. Bryant assessed the situation, quickly formulating a plan. But as he prepared to give the order, he noticed Mullins watching him, a faint smirk playing on his lips. It was a subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, but Bryant understood its meaning. Mullins was daring him, testing his resolve in the face of real danger. Without hesitation, Bryant took the lead, guiding his officers into position, his voice calm and steady as he directed them. Mullins seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to follow the chief's orders. But in the end, he fell in line, his expression unreadable as he moved into position. The tension was palpable as Bryant approached the store, his voice steady as he called out to the suspect, urging him to release the hostage. The man's grip on the gun tightened, his eyes darting between Bryant and the officers surrounding the building. But then, in a final twist, the man slowly lowered his weapon, surrendering as the officers moved in to secure him. As the suspect was led away, Bryant felt a wave of relief, knowing that the situation had ended without bloodshed. But as he turned to face his officers, he saw a look in Mullins' eyes that sent a chill down his spine. A cold, calculating gaze that seemed to promise that this wasn't over, that the battle for the department's soul was only just beginning. And in that moment, Bryant knew that while he had won this round, the fight for the future of his department and his community was far from over. The days following the standoff were filled with tension and reflection, and the story of how Chief Bryant had managed to de-escalate the hostage situation spread like wildfire throughout the town. The people saw it as yet another sign of his commitment to their safety and well-being. And while some officers respected his cool-headed approach, others, particularly Mullins and his group, viewed it with skepticism. Bryant knew the weight of what had happened. He'd succeeded in keeping the peace, but he was no fool. He sensed the resistance that still lurked beneath the surface of his apartment. Yet he also knew that change, especially the kind he was fighting for, didn't come easily. Despite the challenges, Bryant pushed forward. Over the next few weeks, he organized more community forums, invited residents to speak about their experiences, and encouraged his officers to listen and engage with the people they served. Officers like Daniels stepped up, finding purpose in the chief's message, while others remained on the fence, struggling to reconcile their old ways with the new. Bryant could see that he was slowly chipping away at the walls that had divided the department and the community for so long. And while it wasn't happening overnight, the progress was there, and it was real. One evening, as Bryant was wrapping up his work, Daniels knocked on his door, a hesitant look on his face. "Chief, I thought you should know. A few of us have been talking, and we're starting to feel like we're part of something bigger here. I didn't sign up to be a cop just to throw my weight around. I signed up to make a difference. And I know there's been pushback. But, well, a lot of us believe in what we're doing. I just wanted to say thanks." The words hit Bryant harder than he'd expected. This was why he'd accepted this position, despite knowing the challenges he'd face. He offered Daniels a sincere nod of gratitude. "Thank you, Daniels. That means a lot. I know it hasn't been easy, but we're in this together. Change isn't always comfortable, but it's worth it." The two men exchanged a look of mutual respect, and Bryant knew that Daniels was emblematic of the future he was trying to build. A future where the badge represented service, empathy, and integrity. But there was still the matter of Mullins. Bryant was all too aware of the simmering resentment Mullins held, and it was only a matter of time before it would come to a head. One afternoon, after another heated exchange during a briefing, Bryant asked Mullins to step into his office. He knew it was time to address the tension directly, to finally lay everything on the table. Mullins walked into Bryant's office, his face set in a hard line, his arms crossed defensively. "What is it, Chief?" he asked, his tone cold and guarded. Bryant took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Mullins, I know we haven't seen eye to eye since I got here. But I also know you've been here a long time. You've seen things I haven't, and I respect your experience. But this department, our department, needs to evolve. This community deserves better. I'm asking you to work with me, not against me." For a moment, Mullins looked away, his face a mixture of frustration and something that looked almost like regret. "You don't get it, Chief. Things have been this way for so long, and it's not just going to change because you say it should." His voice was filled with an anger that ran deep, but Bryant also heard the exhaustion beneath it, the weight of years spent in a system that had made Mullins the way he was. "I understand, Mullins," Bryant replied softly. "But what if we could make this a department you'd be proud to leave behind? Something you feel good about even when it's time to retire?" He leaned forward, his voice steady. "I'm not here to erase your past. I'm here to build a future, and I want you to be a part of that future." Mullins seemed to wrestle with the words as if they'd stirred something he'd tried to keep buried. His face softened, if only for a moment, before he looked away. "I don't know if I can change, Chief. I don't know if I want to." And with that, he stood, leaving the office with a conflicted expression, leaving Bryant wondering if he finally reached the man's heart, or if Mullins would always be part of the resistance. As the weeks went by, the department started to change in ways both big and small. Officers were connecting more with the residents, responding with understanding rather than intimidation. The town noticed too, and community trust in the department slowly began to improve. Bryant watched with pride as young officers like Daniels took to their roles with a renewed sense of purpose, inspired to protect and serve in the truest sense of the words. One day, Bryant received a letter from Marcus Reed, the community leader who had supported him from the beginning. It was a simple note, thanking him for the work he'd done and letting him know that the community saw him as more than just a chief. They saw him as a neighbor, a friend, and a part of their lives. The words filled Bryant with a quiet pride, a confirmation that his hard work and sacrifices had been worth it. But even with this newfound respect, Mullins remained distant, his resistance a constant undercurrent. It was clear that while Bryant had won over the majority of the department and the community, he couldn't change everyone. Mullins stayed on the fringes, neither openly defiant nor fully cooperative. It was a reminder that change, even the best kind, wouldn't be embraced by everyone. Still, Bryant had made peace with that. He'd come to accept that some people couldn't be changed, and he knew that his success didn't rely on winning everyone over. As the months passed, the department continued to evolve. New recruits came in, inspired by Bryant's vision, and older officers who resisted the change either adapted or quietly moved on. The town's perception of the police transformed as well. People no longer saw the badge as a symbol of fear, but as a promise of protection and fairness. Bryant felt that he'd finally accomplished what he'd set out to do, even if the path had been harder than he'd anticipated. On his last day in office, as Bryant prepared to retire and pass the torch, he stood in front of his team, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He looked at Daniels, now a respected officer and leader within the department, and at the faces of the officers he trained, mentored, and inspired. Bryant's voice was steady, filled with the wisdom he'd gained through every challenge he'd faced. "Remember," he said, looking around the room, "you're not just here to enforce laws. You're here to build trust, to protect, and to serve. This badge means something. It means you're here for everyone. Don't ever forget that." As he walked out of the station for the last time, Bryant felt a sense of fulfillment. He'd come in as an outsider, a stranger facing hostility and resistance. But he'd leave behind a department that was stronger, more united, and more compassionate. And though he knew there would always be challenges, he felt certain that he'd built something lasting, something that would continue to inspire long after he was gone. Outside, the sun was setting over the town he'd come to call home, casting a warm glow over the streets and homes. He looked around, taking in the familiar sights, and smiled, knowing he'd given everything he had. This town, this community, would carry forward the values he'd fought to instill, and he knew in his heart that he'd made a real difference. It was the end of one chapter, the beginning of something bigger, a legacy built on respect, justice, and a commitment to truly serve.